Imagine booking a meeting room. Yesterday, it was $50 an hour. Today, it's $62. Not because you randomly decided to change the price, but because an algorithm noticed that demand had shifted overnight. Now, would that bother you? Or would you simply call it good business? Because whether we like it or not, that's the direction that many industries have already taken. If you've booked a flight recently, or a hotel, or an Uber, or even concert tickets, you've experienced some form of dynamic pricing. Sometimes it works in your favor, sometimes it really doesn't. And now the same conversations are beginning to start in boardrooms all across the co-working world.
I think one thing that's interesting is for a lot of folks in the industry, we really use dynamic pricing with our offices as well. We just call it a different thing.
When we started researching this edition of Undercurrents, I expected a fairly simple conversation. Who uses dynamic pricing? Who doesn't? Does it make any more money? What software are people using? Instead, I found something much more interesting. Because this isn't really a story about pricing. It's a story about yield management. That's the discipline that airlines, hotels, cruise lines have all spent decades refining. The idea is simple. Inventory expires every day. Every empty seat, every empty room, every unsold booking is revenue you'll never get back. If nobody books them today, that opportunity is gone forever. Co-working has exactly the same challenge, which raises a much bigger question. As our industry becomes more sophisticated, how much of the airline and hotel playbook should we adopt before co-working starts to feel less like hospitality and more like yield management? And that's what we will be exploring today. This edition of Undercurrents is underwritten by Nexodus. As one of the first workspace management systems to first introduce dynamic pricing and now AI-assisted dynamic pricing, they help make this research possible. As always though, the views you'll hear today belong entirely to the operators, consultants, and technology providers who generously shared their experiences, and editorial oversight remained with myself. So before we talk about dynamic pricing, I think we need to talk about something much more fundamental. Because dynamic pricing isn't actually the innovation. It's the solution. The interesting question is, what problem is it trying to solve? So let's imagine two businesses. The first is a retailer. If they don't sell a chair today, they can probably sell it tomorrow, or next week, or next month. Their inventory doesn't really disappear. But now imagine a co-working space. If a meeting room sits empty between 10 a.m. and 11 a.m., that hour is gone forever. You can't really put it back on the shelf and hope to sell it tomorrow. The same is true for a hot desk or a day office, your event space, even a private office that's vacant for a month. Every empty hour, every empty day, it's revenue that you'll never really get back. And that's why airlines, hotels, and co-working businesses have something very important in common. We're all managing perishable inventory. Once you start to look at co-working through that lens, the conversation changes. Instead of asking, what should this meeting room cost? You're actually asking, and starting to ask, what's the best way to maximize the value of every hour the meeting room is available? It might sound like a small difference, but it changes everything.
I want to focus on the outcome versus describing the technology behind dynamic pricing. Dynamic pricing is a way to optimize and increase revenue per available room per hour. That's the metric that we are focusing on. And the way we do that with dynamic pricing is understand what is the best price, the optimal price in real time for each and every available meeting room hour throughout the hours of days and days of week.
I really like the way EL framed that, because it doesn't start with algorithms or AI or software, he starts with the outcome. How much revenue can each available room generate? That's the concept that the hotel industry has been obsessing about for decades. Not because they're trying to squeeze every last dollar out of every single guest, but because every unsold room tonight is revenue that's gone forever. So co-working is starting to ask exactly the same question. If a meeting room is available for 8 hours today, but it's only booked for 2 hours, at the end of today, those 6 hours disappear forever. So the question becomes, how do we increase the value of those 8 hours? And that's where things got really interesting. Because when FlexSpace first started experimenting with dynamic pricing, they weren't trying to prove that AI worked. They were trying to answer a much simpler question. Do people actually change their behavior when booking prices change?
After testing that hypothesis for about a year, we found out there is a ratio of 1 to 3, which means that on every 1% you decrease the price, you get 3% more booking volume.
So that's called price elasticity. And whether you're selling airline seats or hotel rooms or meeting rooms, it's one of the most fundamental ideas behind dynamic pricing. But here's where I think many people get the wrong impression. When people hear the words dynamic pricing, they immediately think they're just trying to charge more. That was certainly my assumption with many of the questions I asked. But after speaking to the operators, consultants, and technology providers, I realized that it's only half of the story.
Everyone always think about pricing going up, right? Surge. But that's far from being true. So again, different locations, different operators will have different prices, but sometimes the price will go up. Other times the price will actually go down, okay? The goal here is to increase revenue per available room, okay? Revenue per available room has 2 factors: the rate, which is being booked, and the volume, like how many hours are booked.
Dynamic pricing wasn't just about charging more. It was about changing behavior, encouraging people to book at quieter times, protecting peak availability, finding the demand that might have otherwise never exist. And once I understood that, another realization hit me. Most co-working operators are already doing this. They just don't call it dynamic pricing. When I started researching this topic, I thought that dynamic pricing was essentially something new. Something powered by AI. Something that only the biggest operators were experimenting with. And then I started asking a simple question. Do you use dynamic pricing? And the answers did surprise me. Because almost everyone started by saying, well, not really, or kinda, before describing things that they've been doing for years that were, in reality, exactly that.
You're adjusting your pricing based on availability and demand and office size, term length, all kinds of things. So I think, really we're using dynamic pricing across our entire stack.
That sentence completely changed how I thought about this report. Because if we're honest, most co-working operators have never really treated pricing as something completely fixed. Think about your own business. Have you ever charged more for a window office than an internal one? Offered a discount for a longer commitment? Raised prices because occupancy was approaching capacity? Or negotiated differently because you only had one office left? Maybe you've even adjusted pricing just to stay competitive when another operator opened nearby. If the answer is yes, then you've already been practicing a form of dynamic pricing. Maybe not automatically, maybe not in real time, but certainly intentionally. Pricing has always changed based on availability, lease length, office quality, occupancy, competition, and negotiation. The difference isn't that pricing is suddenly changing. The difference is how quickly it can change, how much information it can consider, and increasingly, who is making that decision?
For private offices, like full-time offices, we do apply dynamic pricing, but in a much more manual way, and it's not automated in the same way our on-demand bookings are. So we look at these with the same factors, just location, occupancy levels, office size, terms, all that kind of stuff on a monthly basis. We review it manually rather than automated.
I think Sarah's distinction is really important because it highlights something that's normally really easy to miss. This isn't a binary decision or choice between static pricing and dynamic pricing. It's a spectrum. At one end, you have completely manual decisions, and at the other, you have software making thousands of tiny pricing adjustments based on live demand and live data. Most operators sit somewhere in the middle today, and that's where I think the conversation often goes off track. Because we tend to focus on the technology, the algorithms, the AI, the automation, but none of these things actually answer the most important question. And that is, what are we trying to optimize? At this point, I thought I understood dynamic pricing. Operators adjust prices, technology helps them do it faster. Everyone makes a little more money. Simple. Except that's not what I found. As I listened back to the interviews, I noticed something. Everyone was describing dynamic pricing, but they weren't actually solving the same problem. Some were trying to maximize revenue, others wanted to fill quiet periods, and others weren't really focused on pricing at all. They were trying to influence customer behavior. That completely changed how I thought about this topic because dynamic pricing isn't really a strategy. It's a tool, and like any tool, it depends on what you're trying to build. Let's start with the most obvious one. Revenue. If you have limited inventory and people are willing to pay more for it, why wouldn't you? For Greg Jakowitz over at Bond Collective, dynamic pricing isn't really about squeezing customer. It's about protecting premium inventory.
Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, our spaces, sometimes weather dependent, but our spaces are full. There's co-working members here. The space is lively. Mondays and Fridays, people are working from home. So the ability to understand that, okay, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, we need to charge more for, whether it be our day passes, our meeting rooms, so on and so forth. And Mondays and Fridays, we need to provide a discount to get people in.
I think that's a really important distinction. Greg isn't charging more because he can. He's charging more because if outside bookings become too cheap, his members lose access to one of the benefits that they're already paying for. Dynamic pricing becomes inventory management, not just revenue management or revenue maximization. But not everyone sees it that way. For Adam, the goal isn't about charging more. It's about changing when people book.
So we leverage dynamic pricing across meeting rooms, predominantly to, I suppose, gain occupancy and look at the days where meeting rooms are less busy. So typically Mondays and Fridays at the moment. And in terms of hours, it's sort of later in the day and earlier in the day. So we have set up our dynamic pricing to fit into those hours and provide cheaper. We're only using it on a cheaper basis at the moment, so reducing the price of meeting rooms rather than inflating them. So members get access to cheaper meeting rooms outside of those hours and those days where demand is typically less.
That's a completely different philosophy. Instead of maximizing revenue during busy periods by adding a premium, he's actually trying to make the quieter periods appear more attractive. It's less about extracting value and more about smoothing demand across the week. If you've ever walked through a co-working space on a Tuesday and then again on a Friday, you'll know exactly why this matters. And then there was Adrian, who took the conversation in an entirely different direction.
I would say we talk always about dynamic pricing, but for me, in general, what we find as well is that it's not so much about, or not only about pricing, right? It's not just about revenue and making prices higher. A lot of this, and I think what a lot of people find is that the behavioral change that this achieves is also important, right? Like it evens out demand. It means that your resources and your inventory is used in a very different way. And actually, this is the fastest change that you will see. It would take some time for you to get to a point where you increase revenue. I would say, like you need to do things slowly and measure all the time and kind of iterate. But you will see very quickly a change in behavior with very basic dynamic pricing rules. Like people just, if you present this clearly to the users and the tenants, then they will easily understand. Okay, so if I book a bit later, it's a bit cheaper, or whatever, right?
That might have been the biggest insight from every interview, because behavior sits upstream from everything else. If you change when people book, what they book, and how often they come back, the revenue follows. And suddenly, dynamic pricing becomes much bigger than just pricing. It's about influencing decisions. What's fascinating is that all three could have been using almost identical technology, the same software, the same algorithms, the same pricing engine. But because they're chasing different outcomes, the recommendations are completely different. One operator increases pricing to protect premium inventory. Another lowers pricing to fill empty space. The third uses pricing to influence behavior. Same tool, different philosophy. And that's why I think we've been asking the wrong question. The question isn't, should co-working use dynamic pricing? The real question is, what are you trying to optimize? Because once you've answered that, the technology becomes surprisingly easy. Which brings us to the next question. If operators are trying to optimize completely different things, how have the tools evolved to support that? Because today's pricing engines look very, very different to the rule-based systems that first appeared a few years ago. By this point, we've established that dynamic pricing isn't new. Operators have always adjusted prices, sometimes consciously, sometimes instinctively, sometimes with spreadsheets, and sometimes with nothing more than just guts and experience. So if the idea itself isn't new, why has dynamic pricing suddenly become one of the hottest conversations in co-working? And the answer isn't about pricing, it's about decision making. Think about how pricing used to happen. A sales manager notices a building is filling up, so office prices increase next month. Meeting rooms seem unusually busy, so someone manually adjusts the rates. Maybe once a quarter, someone reviews competitor pricing. It's thoughtful, it's deliberate, but it's also relatively slow. Today, software can evaluate hundreds or even thousands of signals every single day, and that is fundamentally different.
10 years ago, pricing in Nexus was pretty simple. You had type of rooms or type of resources, as we call them, and then you had maybe an hourly price, half-day price, daily price. And that worked. It was fine. Worked for a while. And then we found, within 3-4 years maybe, that operators obviously needed more. And they were doing the maths themselves. They were basically saying, okay, yeah, my Fridays or my Thursdays evenings are quiet. Let's do a rule-based, you could call it, a rule-based kind of pricing system. And it's quite, I mean, it works. It's just a lot of work, right? Like, and also you need to be good at kind of understanding the data and basically translating that into different rules that actually make sense. And then by the time you finish that, the reality of day-to-day may have changed, or you may go into summer and the demand is completely different. So I would say dynamic pricing is the evolution of a rule-based pricing. It's only that instead of delegating that task to the operator, the system does it kind of automatically, right? So it will detect when your quieter days, quieter hours are, and then will adjust price based on that. So it's just, I think it's a very natural evolution of any pricing system in general, right? Like obviously you want the flexibility, but also not the burden to have to monitor that flexibility and adjust it all the time. And we found, a few years ago, we found operators that they had literally hundreds of prices, and then every so often you need to change prices, right? You need to increase the price by 5%, by 10%, whatever. Then it's a lot of work, right? So these systems obviously make the process way, way simpler because the actual optimizing of the price is done for you. You just need to basically set the baseline, and the system will then adjust based on these rules. So I would say that that's a good kind of evolution from manual pricing, simple, to kind of a rules engine that the operators had to kind of keep up to date, to now a automatic rules engine, basically, that looks at what's happening in your space, who is using and when those resources are being used, and basically adjusts the price based on that.
That evolution really stood out to me because each step didn't replace the previous one. It simply added more context. Rules became recommendations. Recommendations became predictions. Predictions became systems that learn over time. And that's where AI starts becoming genuinely interesting. Not because it can change prices faster, but because it can consider far more variables than any human ever could.
Seasonality, which everyone can understand that, right? Day of week, hour of day, right? So these are all kind of given. But the interesting things that are going on behind that is to understand how the market is behaving, how your location is behaving, what is the lead time for every meeting room, which can vary a lot. So usually we'll see that with larger rooms, you have longer lead time because those room requires more planning, where smaller rooms have this like more on-demand instant booking behavior. So we're looking into market data, but we're also looking how the demand curve is being built within your specific location. So we're not just looking at the demand curve for a specific room, we're looking at the demand curve for other rooms in the location and also other locations around you. We're looking at the lead time, which is super interesting to see how larger rooms will have longer lead time where smaller rooms are more instantly booked. We're looking at urgency, which means that the closer you get to the booking date, then prices will fluctuate. Everyone has this intuition when it comes to booking a flight or hotel room. There are many different input that goes into the model. But what I love the most about being able to work with AI to build dynamic pricing is the fact that the model itself learns over time. So the longer you are on the platform and the more bookings you process, then you'll gain better price accuracy for your specific business. So it's not just about deploying some dynamic pricing strategy. The model or the AI will actually be able to tailor and to adjust pricing strategy per specific operator, per the specific location and room.
What struck me wasn't the number of variables. It was the idea that two operators using exactly the same software could end up with completely different pricing strategies because the software isn't learning co-working. It's learning your co-working business, your members, your booking habits, your demand patterns, your market. That's a very different approach to simply saying Tuesdays should cost more than Fridays. But here is where I think we need to be very careful. Because whenever AI enters the conversation, it's easy to assume that more automation automatically means better decisions. And I don't think that's what we're seeing. What we're really seeing is that operators are being given better information. The decision still belongs to them.
We spent time to understand like each location, how we should think about dynamic pricing, what competitors are charging, and what kind of threshold we should be in at like the most we charge and the least that we charge.
I actually heard this repeatedly. The operators we spoke to weren't handing complete control over to the algorithm. They were defining boundaries, setting minimums, setting maximums, teaching the software how they wanted their business to operate, which means AI isn't replacing judgment, it's just amplifying it. And yet, even with all this technology, the biggest challenge isn't building better algorithms. It's something much more human, because once prices start changing more frequently, how do customers feel about that? How much transparency is enough? And where does optimization start to erode trust? That's where this conversation became even more interesting. Before we tackle those concerns, we should probably ask a simpler question. Does any of this actually work? Up until now, we've talked about philosophy, technology, behavior, different approaches. But eventually, every operator asks the exact same question. Does any of this actually make a meaningful difference? Or is dynamic pricing simply another feature looking for a problem to solve? So I asked everyone the same question. What measurable results have you actually seen?
Dynamic pricing has probably added about 20% to the bottom line for outside bookings specifically. So increase in revenue since we launched dynamic pricing at about 20%.
A 20% increase in outside booking revenue is significant, especially because meeting rooms, day passes, and external bookings often have some of the healthiest margins in a co-working business. But Greg wasn't alone.
Only 6% of our kind of co-working passes, meeting rooms, offices have been booked at the base rate. Only 6%.
Wow.
And 44% were booked at discount and 50% booked at surge.
I actually had to stop Sarah and ask her to repeat those numbers. Only 6% of bookings were made at the standard price. Half of all bookings were automatically priced above it, and almost half below it. That's not a pricing strategy based on fixed rates anymore. That's a pricing strategy that's consistently and constantly adapting to demand.
I have some really interesting information about our Lodo site specifically. 85% of the conference room revenue has come from surged pricing. We have had 0 bookings at that location at our base price. So we have 85% at surge pricing, and the other 15 has come from discounted pricing. But I found that to be really interesting that none of those bookings have taken place at the price we've selected. It's either surged or reduced. And the data carries over into the daily bookings as well. 88% of the bookings that were made for a full day at that location were at a surged rate, which just tells me that we are maximizing our high value inventory and protecting that value of it rather than just discounting our way to volume. I've also found some interesting information in our data around months where we had fewer transactions on our conference rooms, but we had an higher average transaction size. We're getting longer bookings. And so even with like a 15% reduction in the number of transactions, the revenue matched the prior month because of that higher value of those bookings, the longer duration of those bookings. We're seeing a lot more full day or 6-hour or greater bookings, which is great. They're so much easier to manage than 6 1-hour bookings in a day.
One thing that really surprised me was how rarely the base price was actually being used. Instead, pricing was constantly moving, sometimes up, sometimes down, depending on demand, which reinforces something that EL mentioned earlier. Success isn't about charging more. It's about finding the right price for the right time.
So if you are able to increase your revenue per available room by 20, 30, we even seen cases of up to 50%, this is massive because this goes directly into your bottom line.
That's probably one of the most important observations from every interview. Nobody was claiming that dynamic pricing suddenly doubled their business overnight. In fact, EL was quite careful to point out that it doesn't work like that.
Dynamic pricing is not a switch yet that you turn on and suddenly you're able just to double your revenue. It's not the case. It's super small adjustments that are happening over time that eventually compounds into meaningful revenue.
And I think that's an important distinction. Dynamic pricing isn't magic. It doesn't create demand out of nowhere. It simply helps operators make thousands of slightly better pricing decisions over time. Sometimes that means charging more. Sometimes it means charging less. But if those small decisions consistently improve occupancy, protect premium inventory, or encourage better booking behavior, they compound. And that's exactly what operators that we spoke to are starting to see. But commercial success isn't the whole story, because while the numbers were remarkably consistent, the conversations around customer experience we're far more varied and far more divided. If you've ever booked a flight, watched Uber surge price kicking in, or wondered why the hotel room you looked at yesterday suddenly costs more today, you'll probably already know where this conversation is heading. Because increasing revenue is one thing, maintaining trust is something else entirely. After hearing the results, I found myself asking a different question. If dynamic pricing can improve utilization, increase revenue, and help operators make better use of inventory, why isn't everyone doing it already? Their answer, I don't think, has much to do with technology. It has everything to do with trust, because co-working isn't just a collection of desks and meeting rooms. It's really a hospitality business, and hospitality has always relied on something that's difficult to measure: predictability. People like knowing what to expect, not just from your community or your service, but from your pricing too.
What I've seen from brands is actually interesting. When I've talked about bringing dynamic pricing as an option, they've actually pushed back on it. Why? They want a consistency for their members, and they don't want their members to feel like they're being nickeled and dimed.
That phrase really stuck with me, nickel and dimed, because once members start questioning whether they're paying the right price, the conversation changes. They're no longer thinking about the meeting that they came to have. They're thinking about the transaction. And that's a very different experience. Sarah made another point that I think is just as important: transparency.
Yeah, I would say there's definitely challenges when implementing dynamic pricing. It's, the biggest challenge I think is balancing it with transparency. I think especially our industry, people are very used to just one price. It's not common to see that kind of model play out in flex workspace. So I think it has definitely come with challenges around, why did I come on yesterday and this price was what I saw, and then I came back to book it today and it's a different price. And that is, difficult to manage, and it's difficult to explain that, we actually kind of operate this demand pricing model, which sometimes people understand and sometimes doesn't sit well. So you do have to balance that transparency versus, the optimization of pricing, which can cause some frustration.
Customers don't necessarily expect prices to stay the same forever, but they do expect to understand why they've changed. When that explanation is missing, people often assume the worst. And we've seen that happen in plenty of other industries. Take Wendy's. Earlier this year, they announced plans for digital menus and dynamic pricing. Almost immediately, the internet interpreted that as surge pricing for burgers. The backlash was enormous. Wendy's later clarified that wasn't what they meant, but by then, public perception had already taken over. Whether the pricing model was fair almost became irrelevant. People believed that they were being treated unfairly, and trust disappeared almost overnight. I think there's an important lesson there for co-working. Communication isn't something you do after changing pricing. It's part of the pricing strategy itself.
The one thing I just want to add to that is that our members have an allocation of conference rooms. So they get a certain amount of hours for free, and the dynamic pricing doesn't affect them.
Greg's approach was interesting because he avoids the problem almost entirely. Members experience consistency. Dynamic pricing is largely reserved for external bookings, where variable pricing is already expected and a premium price is normally part of the course. That's a subtle distinction, but I think it's an important one. Maybe the question isn't, should we use dynamic pricing? Maybe it's actually, where should we use it? That was actually one of the strongest themes across every interview. Nobody argued that the algorithms should replace hospitality. Quite the opposite. The operators who were most successful with dynamic pricing were also the ones thinking hardest about the member experience. Technology was helping them make better commercial decisions, but relationships, communication, and trust were still being managed by people. And I think that's where this conversation becomes much bigger than pricing. Because if the purpose of dynamic pricing is to optimize the value of your inventory, The purpose of hospitality is to optimize something else entirely: how people feel.
I do think, in a lot of co-working spaces, the human touch is the special sauce. The relationship that your staff develops with guests, members, the guests of your members, all of that is so important. So we are still, every time someone is doing a self-checkout, we are doing a personal reach out. We are talking to each of those people. What are you coming in for? What's the purpose of your meeting? Who are you meeting with? Can I get this information over to them? Here's my phone number. Here's my email. Call me. Let's get in touch anytime you have questions. Anything we can help you with. So I think the answer is we're working through it by continuing to leverage the personal relationships, and for me that's where AI and automation are the real tools. Is people have that, and self booking. People have that ability to self enable that then allows the people staff members, the real humans, to have that connection that AI can't replicate, and to build that personal rapport.
The best operators understand that those aren't competing goals. They have to work together. Which leads us to one final question. Today's pricing engines are already learning from occupancy, lead time, booking behavior, and demand. Tomorrow they'll be capable of considering so much more. So where should we as an industry draw the line? Throughout this report, we've looked at why dynamic pricing exists, why operators are adopting it, the results they're seeing, and the importance of maintaining trust. But every one of those conversations led me to the same question: where does this stop? Because today's systems can already consider occupancy, availability, booking behavior, lead times, and demand. Tomorrow, they'll almost certainly be capable of much more. The weather, major events, flight arrivals, conference schedules, local hotel occupancy, competitor pricing, customer history, loyalty, even predicting someone's likelihood to book. The technology is moving incredibly quickly, which means the real question isn't what AI can do, it's what we should ask it to do. One topic I deliberately explored during the interviews was personalized pricing. Not dynamic pricing, personalized pricing, because they're often confused and they're very different things.
So we don't do this right now to the individual, you could say. Although obviously that data is there, we could potentially see if we can spot some patterns. But we do this, for example, we do clusters of meeting room users based on membership, for example. This is something that the model that forecasts demand already takes into consideration, right? So it's not the individual, but yeah, we look at, okay, is this a private office customer, or is this a hot desk customers, and things like that. And then based on that, we model how likely a booking is to happen, or how busy a particular hot desk area will be, things like that. But it doesn't go all the way down to the individual person.
I thought Adrian's answer was very telling. The technology is capable of becoming increasingly personal, but capability doesn't automatically become strategy. There's a conscious decision being made about where to stop. And I think that's important. Every industry that has embraced dynamic pricing has eventually faced the same temptation. Can we optimize a little bit more? Can we make pricing a little bit smarter? Can we personalize this just a little bit further? Sometimes the answer has been yes. Other times, customers have pushed back, not because the technology failed, because it crossed an invisible line. And that's why I don't think that this edition is really about dynamic pricing at all. It's about judgment, because every operator is going to draw that line somewhere different. Some will be perfectly comfortable changing prices every hour. Others may never move beyond seasonal pricing. Neither approach is inherently right. What's important is that pricing strategy matches what you are trying to build. I kept coming back to something that Greg said, protecting members, and something Adam said, changing behavior, and something Janice said, avoiding that feeling of being nickeled and dimed, something Sarah said, being transparent, and something Adrian and EL both demonstrated. Technology is becoming incredibly capable, but nobody suggested that we should optimize absolutely everything, and that surprised me. Because I expected this conversation to be about the software, the technology, the AI. Instead, it turned out to be about the values. Which brings us back to where we started. Should co-working become more like the airlines or the hotels or ride-sharing platforms? Maybe. There are certainly lessons worth learning. But co-working also has something that those industries don't. Community, relationships, belonging. If dynamic pricing helps strengthen those things, it's probably serving the industry well. If it starts undermining them, perhaps we've crossed the line. Dynamic pricing isn't going away. In fact, it's probably only just getting started. But after these conversations, I don't think the question is whether co-working should embrace yield management. I think the question is much simpler. How much of it belongs in a hospitality business? Because every meeting room, every vacant office, and every unbooked desk represents an opportunity. The challenge isn't deciding whether to optimize for that opportunity. It's deciding how much humanity we're willing to preserve while doing it.